Part 4 of this video series ended with the 5th Kentucky Infantry having been chased from the state by William Bull Nelson's Union Army, but not before Jack May's Company A, containing the Barkers and Gevedons, along with Company C, drew blood in an ambush at Ivy Mountain in Floyd County. 52-year-old William Barker, the family patriarch, was killed, dying in his son Henry's arms, and had to be left behind as they fled south toward the Virginia border to resupply. They spent several miserable weeks at Pound Gap without adequate clothing, food, or shelter before General Humphrey Marshall arrived with 2 regiments of Virginians. Marshall found the men of the 5th to be, quote, miserably clad, very inexpert in the use of guns, but brave and good-looking, unquote. It was at this time that they may have earned the nickname the Ragamuffin Brigade. Marshall moved his entire army to Abington, Virginia, where there was more food and clothing available, although some accounts claim that all or part of the army remained at Pound Gap. In any case, they weren't there long before Marshall had them heading back to Kentucky just before Christmas, giving the 5th Kentucky the honor of leading the advance into their homeland. They met no resistance as they re-entered the state, since Nelson had withdrawn his Union forces back to central Kentucky. However, a second army was heading south under Colonel James A. Garfield to block Marshall's anticipated return and to suppress other secessionist activity. By mid-December, Jack May and most likely some or all of his Company A were back in West Liberty looking for new recruits. It is unknown if Barkers or Gevedons were among them. The New York Times reported on December 15th that about 100 men were in West Liberty under the cowardly bully named Jack May. They have produced a perfect terror in the mountains, and the panic-stricken Union men have fled in every direction. Meanwhile, Marshall moved the rest of his army down the Big Sandy River and camped the main body of infantry on the farm of Daniel Hager, just south of Paintsville, and his cavalry at the mouth of Jenny's Creek, west of town, 3 days before Christmas, 1861. Jack May and his men did manage to find a good number of recruits who arrived at the Hager farm camp near Paintsville, including one remarkable character, 17-year-old George Washington Noble, who 50 years later would write a memoir of his time in the 5th Kentucky Infantry in amazing detail. His account would become invaluable in piecing together the rest of the Barkers and Gevedons' experiences during their 1-year enlistment. Although many of the regimental records have been lost, according to researcher Greg Barker, based on pension applications and other sources, 6 more Barkers joined the 5th Kentucky at about this time, including John Albert Barker, for whom there is a known photo. They were all grandsons of Hezekiah Barker, who had died in Wilkes County, North Carolina. It is possible that they were persuaded by their Barker cousins if they were indeed part of the recruiting party. The new recruit's grandmother, Susanna, had moved the entire family to Elliott County, Kentucky, just north of West Liberty, in 1825. On January 4, 1862, some of Garfield's Union soldiers made first contact with Marshall's Confederates patrolling Tom's Creek northeast of Paintsville. 3 days later, his army surprised Marshall's cavalry camped on the mouth of Jenny's Creek. The Confederates fled, but later skirmished briefly with Union forces. On January 9th, Marshall broke his Hager farm camp and moved his army back toward Prestonsburg, slogging through deep mud, and camped on Abbott Creek west of town. He sent a detachment of men to the steam mill of Jack May's father, Samuel May, to grind corn and make bread, but they were surprised by Union troops during the night and driven away. Marshall's men were left to shuck and pound their own corn. Garfield camped his army in the rain on the crest of a wooded hill near the May farm. The next morning, the 10th, on learning that the Confederates had broken camp on Abbott Creek and headed south over the ridge, Garfield took his army up Middle Creek in hopes of cutting them off, but Marshall's army was waiting for them at the forks of Middle Creek. He positioned 3 artillery pieces on the flat across Left Fork, with Trigg's 54th Virginia Infantry, the Mounted Rifles, and part of the 1st Kentucky Cavalry in reserve above them on the hill. 3 more companies of the 1st Cavalry were positioned on the west end of the mountain to the east, and 2 more directly across the creek on the hill. Most were dismounted. To their right was the 29th Virginia Infantry, and on the right flank was the 5th Kentucky Infantry with up to 3 Gevedons and 10 Barkers, as well as George Washington Noble. About 10 a.m., Garfield encountered Marshall's pickets, or lookouts. Unsure of the Army's position, he ordered about 20 cavalrymen into the valley to draw fire and locate them. Some of Marshall's men responded with a volley, and Garfield got a good look at Confederate positions from a high vantage point. Then he ordered his army to come forward to begin deploying while holding some units in reserve. Garfield positioned the 40th and 42nd Ohio Infantries and cavalry on the hill opposite the 29th Virginia. Whether by design or by chance, he positioned his only Kentucky units, the 14th and 22nd Kentucky Infantries, on their left, directly opposite the 5th Kentucky Confederate Infantry, setting up a tragic case of fratricide, pitting Kentucky neighbor against neighbor, symbolic of the greater divisions in Kentucky throughout the war. There were now about 1,100 Federals facing 1,900 rebels, as the latter were always referred to by the New York Times. The fog of war invariably produces differing accounts, but the following was taken from Marshall's field report to headquarters. At about noon, Garfield ordered his 2 Ohio infantry regiments into the flat with cavalry covering. 3 rounds of Marshall's artillery, scaring the horses, scattered their cavalry. Garfield then ordered them across swollen Middle Creek and up the hill. He sent the 14th and 22nd Kentucky regiments on 2 flanks to face their fellow Kentuckians of the 5th Infantry, and here some of the fiercest fighting occurred, including hand-to-hand combat. One of the soldiers fighting his way up the hill to face perhaps 10 Barkers was one Hezekiah Barker of the 22nd Kentucky Union Infantry, also a grandson of Hezekiah Sr. If 11 soldiers with the same great-grandfather fighting in the same section of a battle was not a Civil War record, it was certainly unusual. After the Union infantries had crossed the creek and occupied the base of the hill, the Confederate artillery battery became ineffective, and Trigg's 54th Infantry protecting it was brought to the aid of Moore's 29th Infantry's right flank. Later in the battle, Marshall ordered the smooth-bore 6-pound cannon moved to occupy a piney point in front of the 54th, which, according to Marshall, quote, obtained a fair flank fire at the enemy and attracted a lot of hot fire, but no further damage than the shooting of one of the artillery horses through the head, unquote. The actions of the Confederate and Union cavalry units at this point are uncertain. Marshall said of the Union cavalry after they were scattered by the Confederate cannon fire, quote, if they did anything more during the day, it was done on foot. We plainly heard the command to force the cavalry forward, but the cavalry did not make its appearance again, unquote. The initial purpose of the Confederate cavalry units occupying the heights on the north side of the creek, armed with Belgian rifles, was to, quote, command the plain and resist any advance of skirmishers from the opposite heights, unquote. In any case, most of the action was in the center and east end of the battlefield. George Noble on the right flank with the Barkers and Gevedons said, we formed a line on the top of the mountain. As we marched out, a cannon roared and guns were cracking at our left. Firing began on the right. The balls were going over our heads and we were ordered to lie down. At that instant, a bullet hit the side of the bush by my face. I fell down quickly and did not rise up until we were ordered to. The Confederates, holding the high ground, repeatedly repelled advances up the mountain. The battle ebbed and flowed, up and then back down the hill, interspersed with some periods of regrouping. Garfield later wrote, quote, the whole hill was enshrouded in such a volume of smoke as rolls from the mouth of a volcano, and thousands of gun flashes leapt like lightning from the cloud, unquote. The 5th Kentucky repelled at least 3 charges up the northeast end of the mountain. The stalemate was broken about 4 p.m. when 700 Union reinforcements from Paintsville arrived and began slowly pushing the Confederates up the hill for good. At dusk, the fighting stopped and the Federals withdrew. By this time, Marshall's men had not eaten for more than 30 hours. Fearing mass desertion by his tired, cold, and hungry forces, he ordered the burning of his heaviest wagons and retreated southward to look for food for his men and forage for his horses. They traveled up left fork of Middle Creek, over Brushy Mountain and down Brush Creek, and camped on the farm of Joseph Gerhardt. George Noble said, the Yankees fell back and we lay there until night, and then we marched about 6 miles and camped in a cornfield. We used fence rails to make fire. For supper, our mess had bacon and parched corn, which we found in the field. Had same for breakfast. Although about 3,000 men fought furiously at Middle Creek, only about 15 were killed, including 12 Confederates, with a few captured. But these estimates vary. As far as is known, no Barkers or Gevedons were among them. It was another victory for the Union and catapulted James A. Garfield from obscurity to the eventual presidency. It was also a demonstration that no Confederate army could hold positions in Kentucky with such a long supply line and over steep terrain in bad weather. After a week on the Gerhardt farm, Marshall camped his army on Rockhouse Creek in Letcher County for another week and then took them to Whitesburg. Within a week or so, he took the bulk of his army to camp at Gladeville, now Wise, Virginia, but left the 5th Kentucky behind at Whitesburg to block Union forces should they come that far south. Soon enough, the Barkers and Gevedons would leave their state once more and were no doubt unhappy about it. A more dangerous enemy than any federal army awaited them. It will be explored in part 6 of this video series.